In Hollywood, success isn't about talent. It's about connections. And if you don't got the right ones, don't worry. Now you can get everything you need with the Hollywood Fixer Starter Kit. What's included? One studio contract ironclad edition. No residuals, no freedom, no problem. You'll be famous, broke, and completely owned. Luxury lifestyle package. Big house, covered. Fancy car, covered. Your dignity? Negotiable. Custom tailored identity. We dress you. We fund you. We own you. 24/7 psychological pressure system. Late night calls. Silent hang-ups. Maybe a little friendly reminder you ain't alone. Sleep is optional. Emotional leverage add-on. Love something? Now imagine it, gone. Just like that. And when you're no longer useful, don't worry. Our final exit solution handles everything. Clean narrative. Cooperative authorities. Instant reputation rewrite. From problem to tragic headline in under 24 hours. Hollywood Fixer Starter Kit. Because in this town, you don't own your success. It owns you. And some people don't get to walk away.
Pete Saverse Studios. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. George Reeves, Superman, The Fixer, and The Final Fall. On television, Superman was bulletproof. But on June 16, 1959, a single gunshot proved George Reeves was just a mortal caught in a lethal trap. He was found naked and bleeding, his skull blown open. The LAPD called it suicide, but the crime scene screamed murder. Was his real crime sleeping with the wife of Eddie Mannix, the mob's apex predator in Hollywood? He played an invincible hero for the cameras. But off-screen, even Superman answered to the syndicate. His descent into that fatal trap started not with a scandal, but with a dream. The Dream Factory chews him up. George Reeves arrived in California with the ambition to be a leading man, armed with a granite jaw and broad shoulders. But the studio machine chewed him up. By 1951, facing a stalled career and mounting debts, he accepted a job he initially despised, playing Superman on television. Reeves severely underestimated the medium. Adventures of Superman became a colossal, unprecedented phenomenon. He achieved global fame, but the studio executives had locked him into an ironclad contract with zero rights to residuals. The role became a suffocating prison. He was completely typecast, unable to land serious film roles. Reeves was a global icon who could barely afford his groceries, trapped in a paradox of extreme visibility and extreme poverty. He was a man playing the strongest entity in the universe. But in reality, he had absolutely zero power over his own life. This is the exact vulnerability the underworld preys upon. The mafia operates like a predatory lending institution. They look for the desperate, the vain, and the broke. They look for people who have everything to lose and no legitimate way to save themselves. George Reeves was standing on the edge of a financial and professional cliff. He needed a lifeline. He needed a benefactor who could provide him with the lifestyle his fame demanded, but his salary denied. He was ready to sell his soul. He just needed to find the right buyer. He needed someone who could give him the cars, the tailored suits, and the Beverly Hills address that would make him feel like a real star rather than a studio employee in a cheap spandex suit. In the ecosystem of 1950s Hollywood, if you wanted to live beyond your means, you did not go to a bank. You went to the fixers. You went to the people who operated the shadow economy of the studios. You sought out the individuals who controlled the flow of illicit cash. The people who could buy police silence and arrange lucrative off-the-books favors. George Reeves, tired of the struggle, tired of the humiliation of being a poor superstar, stepped willingly into the web. He did not know that the money he was about to accept was not a gift. It was a down payment on his life. He was about to trade the grueling restrictions of a studio contract for the lethal restrictions of mafia ownership. He was about to become a kept man. Tony Mannix acquires an asset. Tony Mannix did not court George Reeves. She acquired him. Her name was Camille Juanita Wills, but the underworld and the Hollywood elite knew her as Tony. She began her career utilizing her physical assets as a showgirl in the Ziegfeld Follies. She learned early that beauty was a depreciating currency, but leverage was forever. She survived the meat grinder of the entertainment industry by aligning herself with absolute power. By the early 1950s, the showgirl days were long gone. She was approaching 50. Her features had hardened into the severe lines of a woman who had seen too much and compromised too often. Tony Mannix possessed immense wealth, untouchable social status, and severe boredom, a volatile combination in 1950s Hollywood. She attended the right parties, drank at the right clubs, and observed the desperate ecology of Los Angeles. She spotted George Reeves. She saw the broad shoulders, the tailored but fraying suits, and the unmistakable panic in his eyes. Tony Mannix recognized a drowning man. Instead of a rescue, she offered him absolute financial captivity, disguised as luxury. The transaction lacked the messy, unpredictable rituals of courtship. Courtship implies a negotiation between equals. Tony approached Reeves with the clinical precision of a corporate takeover. She assessed his debts. She calculated his desperation. She made her move. She did not seduce him with words. She seduced him with infrastructure. She bought a sprawling, luxurious house at 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive. She handed the keys to Reeves. It was not a gift. It was a holding pen. She furnished the rooms. She paid the property taxes. She covered the utility bills. She walked into luxury car dealerships and purchased a pristine Nash Healey sports car. She handed him the registration. She sent him to her personal tailor. She dressed him in imported wool and Italian leather. She stuffed his pockets with $100 bills so he could tip the valet and the bartenders, allowing him to maintain the illusion of male provider status in public. George Reeves, the man who bent steel and caught bullets on television, allowed himself to be dressed, housed, and funded like a life-sized doll. He accepted the keys. He took the cash. He willingly surrendered his autonomy in exchange for the appearance of prosperity. He traded the grueling anxiety of poverty for the quiet, suffocating humiliation of being a kept man. The public humiliation was immediate and relentless. They attended the premier restaurants in the city, Romanoff's, Chasen's, the Mocambo. Tony walked into the dining rooms with George strapped to her arm. When the check arrived, she paid it. She tipped the maitre d'. Everyone in the room understood the exact nature of the arrangement. The studio executives, the rival actors, the vicious gossip columnists. They all smiled at Reeves to his face and mocked him behind their menus. They knew he was not a lover. To the Hollywood elite, Reeves was merely Tony's expensive accessory, a physical manifestation of her immense purchasing power. Eddie Mannix, the fixer. But Tony Mannix did not generate her own wealth. The money flowing into the Benedict Canyon house, the cash paying for the Nash Healy, the funds covering the bespoke suits, all of it came from a single terrifying source. Her husband, Edgar Joseph Mannix, was the vice president and general manager of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. But titles in Hollywood are often polite fictions meant to sanitize brutal realities. Eddie Mannix was not a filmmaker. He was the fixer. He was a bulldog of a man built like a brick wall, possessing a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass permanently locked onto the abyss. As vice president of MGM, Eddie Mannix operated a shadow police force within the borders of Los Angeles. When a studio star committed a violent crime or crashed a car while intoxicated, Eddie arrived with untraceable cash. He bought police silence, altered reality, and dictated what the newspapers buried. This absolute power was backed by his direct ties to the Chicago outfit and local crime families. The studios required the mob to keep the theaters open and the supply lines running, and Eddie Mannix was the ruthless linchpin holding this corrupt ecosystem together. Eddie knew everything about Tony and George Reeves. He knew the address of the Benedict Canyon house. He knew the purchase price of the Nash Healy. He personally signed the checks that funded his wife's extravagant affair. He allowed it. He encouraged it. He permitted this blatant infidelity because Eddie Mannix possessed a sociopathic understanding of leverage in human capital. Eddie maintained his own roster of mistresses. He kept a younger actress on a permanent retainer, setting her up in a separate, luxurious apartment, completely funded by studio money. By granting Tony permission to keep her pet actor, Eddie purchased his own absolute freedom. It was a cynical, bloodless arrangement designed to maintain the structural integrity of their marriage while allowing both parties to indulge their appetites. But there was a darker, more insidious psychological layer to Eddie's tolerance. By funding George Reeves, Eddie effectively owned him. George was not stealing Eddie's wife. Eddie was leasing his wife out, and George was paying the interest in total emasculating compliance. Eddie frequently invited George to dinner at his own home. He played golf with him at exclusive country clubs. He treated the television star with the patronizing, heavy-handed affection a man reserves for a moderately intelligent, obedient dog. George sat at the Mannix dining table, eating the imported steak Eddie paid for, drinking the aged scotch Eddie provided, fully aware that the man sitting across from him could snap his fingers and end his life. This was the ultimate power trip for the fixer. He exerted total financial and physical control over the invincible hero of the American public. Superman answered to Eddie. The keeper becomes the cage. The psychological toll on Reeves was devastating. The luxurious Benedict Canyon house soon felt less like a sanctuary and more like a holding cell. Every tailored garment and piece of furniture was a daily reminder of his complete financial dependence. The bespoke silk suits felt like sandpaper against his skin. The engine of the sports car sounded like a rattling chain. He looked in the mirror and despised the reflection staring back. He was a fraud of massive proportions. On the television set, he stood tall, hands resting confidently on his hips, delivering lines about truth, justice, and the American way. The child actors looked at him with awe. The crew looked at him with quiet, knowing pity. The moment the director called cut, the illusion dissolved. He drove home to a woman he did not love, walked into a house he did not own, and lived a life entirely funded by a mafia-connected enforcer who could order a murder as casually as ordering a martini. He started drinking. He drank heavily, deliberately, and constantly. The alcohol was a necessary daily anesthetic. Without the numbing effect of the liquor, the reality of his situation was too sharp, too blinding to endure. He drank to forget the whispers at the Mocambo. He drank to forget the patronizing smile on Eddie Mannix's face. He drank to forget that he was 40 years old and completely trapped. The years dragged on. The television show maintained its grueling, relentless pace. The fame expanded exponentially, but the bank account remained stagnant. He was entirely dependent on Tony's allowance. The relationship, built on a foundation of commerce and desperation, turned venomous. Tony was fiercely possessive. She treated him like an expensive, fragile antique. She was intensely jealous of his female co-stars. She threw violent, screaming tantrums if he looked at another woman. She demanded his constant, undivided presence. If he attempted to assert any form of independence, if he tried to take a job outside of her sphere of influence, she immediately threatened to cut off the money. She reminded him constantly and viciously that he was nothing without her. She told him he was a washed-up hack before she found him, and he would be a starving beggar the minute she left him. She held his lifestyle hostage. He was trapped in a financial and emotional chokehold. The grip was tightening. The desire to break free, to reclaim his manhood, began as a quiet whisper in his alcohol-soaked mind and rapidly grew into a deafening roar. He needed an exit. He needed to look a woman in the eye without feeling like a purchased commodity. He needed to pay for his own meal. He started looking for a way out. He began plotting his escape from the Benedict Canyon house and the suffocating grasp of Tony Mannix. But George Reeves fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his captivity. He believed he was simply in a toxic, unhappy relationship with a wealthy older woman. He treated the situation like a standard Hollywood breakup. He failed to comprehend the architecture of the trap he had stepped into years ago. He did not realize that he was entangled in a mafia contract. In the underworld, you do not simply pack your bags and walk out the front door. You do not issue a breakup speech to the wife of a syndicate boss. You belong to the organization until the organization decides you are no longer useful. You are a piece of leased machinery. When a machine stops functioning according to the parameters set by the owner, it is not set free. It is dismantled. And when the syndicate discards a broken asset, they do not leave it breathing. Leonore Lemon and the Rebellion. The exit strategy did not materialize as a calculated plan. It arrived as a chaotic, volatile force of nature named Leonore Lemon. She was a New York cafe society girl, a minor actress with a reputation for loud arguments, heavy drinking, and an absolute disregard for the established hierarchies of Hollywood. She did not care about studio bosses. She did not respect the invisible boundaries drawn by the syndicates. She operated on impulse and entitlement. George Reeves looked at her and saw a life raft. He saw a woman who belonged to a different world, a world where Eddie Mannix held no jurisdiction. Reeves was suffocating. The air inside the Benedict Canyon house had grown toxic, thick with the scent of Tony Mannix's expensive perfume and the unspoken threat of her husband's power. Reeves desperately needed oxygen. Leonore Lemon was a hurricane. She blew into Los Angeles and immediately disrupted the carefully maintained equilibrium of Reeves's life. She was significantly younger than Tony. She was brash. She was demanding. And crucially, she expected Reeves to be a man, not a pet. Emboldened by his new relationship, Reeves severely underestimated his vulnerability. He decided he was finally going to cut the strings and openly attempted to sever ties with Mannix. He committed the ultimate sin of the kept man. He did not quietly pack his bags, surrender the keys to the sports car, walk away from the mansion, and beg for forgiveness. He attempted to keep the spoils of his captivity while discarding the captor. He told Tony Mannix the arrangement was over. He delivered the news with the clumsy, brutal bluntness of a man who has been cowed for too long and suddenly finds his voice. He told her he was in love. He told her he was getting married. Then he executed a maneuver of staggering, suicidal arrogance. He moved Leonore Lemon into the house at 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive. He brought his new, younger fiancée into the exact physical space that Tony Mannix's money had purchased. He slept with Leonore in the bed Tony bought. He parked Leonore's luggage next to the wardrobe filled with the bespoke suits Tony had funded. It was a territorial theft. In the animal kingdom and in the criminal underworld, taking another predator's territory is an act of war. Reeves treated it like a bad breakup. He thought he was simply ending an affair. He failed to comprehend that he was violating a deeply entrenched mafia contract. He was a leased asset attempting to declare bankruptcy while refusing to return the collateral. Tony Mannix did not react with the quiet dignity of a spurned lover. She reacted with the apocalyptic fury of a sovereign whose borders had been breached. She was a woman who had spent decades navigating the most treacherous male-dominated ecosystem on Earth. She had secured her position at the top of the Hollywood food chain through ruthless pragmatism and her marriage to a syndicate enforcer. Being dumped by a fading, heavily indebted television actor for a younger woman was a humiliation she categorically refused to endure. The retaliation began immediately. It was designed to shatter his nerves. The telephone at the Benedict Canyon house began to ring at all hours of the night. When Reeves or Leonore answered, there was only silence on the other end, followed by the soft, menacing click of a disconnected line. Sometimes a voice would whisper violent, graphic threats. The harassment was relentless. It was psychological warfare designed to remind Reeves that he was never truly alone, that the eyes of the Mannix Empire were always watching. Tony escalated the assault. She dispatched men to the house while Reeves was on set. They did not break in to steal money. They broke in to steal his sense of security. They stole his beloved pet Schnauzer. The theft of the dog was a targeted, cruel message. It demonstrated that locks and doors meant nothing. It proved they could reach into his sanctuary and take whatever he loved. Reeves was devastated. He was a man who had built a career playing the ultimate protector. Yet he could not even protect his own dog in his own home. The whispers in the elite restaurants of Los Angeles changed their tune. The patrons at Chasen's and Romanoff's no longer mocked Reeves for being a gigolo. They whispered about him with a morbid, terrified fascination. They watched him walk in with Leonore Lemon, and they saw a dead man walking. They knew the rules. Everyone in the industry knew the rules. You do not publicly humiliate Tony Mannix. The fixer decides the asset is in default. The humiliation was not contained to Tony. The shockwaves of Reeves's rebellion reached the polished, heavily guarded office of Eddie Mannix at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Eddie sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing the reports from his network of informants. He knew about the late-night phone calls. He knew about the stolen dog. He knew about Leonore Lemon moving into the Benedict Canyon property. Eddie did not care about the infidelity. He had never cared about the emotional fidelity of his wife. But he cared deeply, violently about the optics of power. In the Mafia, respect is the primary currency. It is the invisible armor that prevents rival syndicates from moving in on your territory. Eddie Mannix derived his authority from the absolute fear he instilled in others. He was the fixer. He made problems disappear. Now, a B-list television actor in a spandex suit was creating a very loud, very public problem. George Reeves was making Eddie Mannix look weak. The logic of the underworld is cold and absolute. If a man cannot control his wife's pet, how can he control the unions? If a man allows an actor to steal a house and parade a new woman around town, how can he be trusted to enforce the omerta of the Chicago outfit? Eddie's associates in the crime families were watching. They were waiting to see how the fixer would handle the insubordination. Eddie made a calculation. George Reeves was no longer a useful distraction for his wife. He had become a liability. He had breached the contract. He had insulted the firm. In the business of organized crime, liabilities are not fired. They are liquidated. Eddie did not feel jealousy. He felt the cold necessity of corporate restructuring. The Reeves account was in default. The asset was insubordinate. The inventory needed to be liquidated. Eddie did not scream. He did not throw a tantrum. He simply activated the machinery. He picked up the telephone and began to systematically dismantle George Reeves's life. He called the studio executives. He called the casting directors. He called the producers. He issued a silent, definitive decree. George Reeves was toxic. Nobody was to hire him. Nobody was to take his calls. Reeves felt the squeeze immediately. Adventures of Superman had ceased production. He needed work. He needed money to support his new lifestyle with Leonore, to pay for the expensive dinners and the endless flow of alcohol she demanded. He called his agent. The agent was evasive. He went to auditions. The casting directors looked at him with pity and fear, and quickly showed him the door. The industry had closed ranks. The Iron Curtain of Eddie Mannix's influence had fallen. Reeves was completely blacklisted. The financial pressure mounted. The bank accounts dwindled. Leonore, accustomed to high society wealth, grew increasingly frustrated with the reality of Reeves's situation. The arguments in the Benedict Canyon house became frequent and violent. They drank heavily. They screamed at each other. The sanctuary had turned into a pressure cooker. Reeves finally realized the magnitude of his error. The delusion of the cape evaporated, leaving a terrified, aging man staring into the abyss. He understood that Tony's stolen dog and late-night phone calls were merely the opening skirmishes. The real threat was the deafening silence from Eddie Mannix. Eddie's silence was the silence of a predator calculating the angle of the kill. Paranoia in Benedict Canyon. Fear consumed Reeves. It altered his physical chemistry. He lost weight. His hands shook. He sweated profusely. He could not sleep. When he did manage to close his eyes, he was plagued by nightmares of men in dark suits kicking down his door. He started carrying a weapon. He bought a 9mm German Luger. He kept it loaded. He placed it on the nightstand beside his bed every single night. He kept a shotgun near the front door. He was Superman. Millions of children believed he could fly. But in the dark, sweltering nights of the California summer, he sat in his bedroom clutching a piece of cold steel, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, waiting for the executioners to arrive. The house became a fortress of paranoia. Reeves constantly checked the locks. He peered through the curtains, his eyes scanning the dark driveway for unfamiliar cars. He knew the layout of the property was against him. The house sat on a steep hill, isolated, surrounded by dense foliage. It was beautiful, but strategically it was a death trap. It provided perfect cover for anyone wishing to approach unseen. He tried to keep up appearances. He attended a few public events, forcing a tight, panicked smile for the cameras. He tried to project the image of a man happily moving on with his life. But those who looked closely saw the exhaustion carving deep lines into his face. They saw a man hollowed out by terror. He was drinking massive quantities of scotch, trying to numb the relentless, agonizing anticipation of violence. Leonore Lemon offered no solace. She was oblivious to the true danger. She did not understand the mechanics of the Hollywood underworld. She thought Tony Mannix was just a crazy ex-girlfriend. She thought Reeves was being paranoid. She mocked his fear. She demanded they go out, drink, and socialize. Her reckless ignorance only amplified Reeves's terror. He was chained to a woman who was loudly ringing the dinner bell while they were surrounded by wolves. The spring of 1959 turned into summer. The heat in Los Angeles grew oppressive, mirroring the suffocating tension inside the house. The harassment from Tony continued, but it began to take on a darker, more final tone. The threats became less about ruining his career and more about ending his life. Reeves knew he had to make a move. He considered fleeing. He considered packing his bags, leaving Leonore behind, and driving to Mexico or flying to Europe. But his finances were entirely paralyzed. Eddie had ensured that Reeves could not access significant capital. He was trapped geographically by his lack of funds, and trapped psychologically by his own paralyzing fear. He attempted to negotiate. He sent messages through intermediaries trying to reach a truce with Tony. He offered to move out of the house. He offered to return the car. He tried to surrender. But in the eyes of those who suspect foul play, the syndicate does not accept surrender once an insult has been formalized. If the underworld rumors are true, the machinery was already in motion. Eddie Mannix had allegedly given the nod, and a contract had been issued. To them, it was no longer a matter of if George Reeves would face the consequences. It was merely a matter of when, and how precisely the message would be delivered. The night of June 15th. The countdown to June 16th had begun, ticking away in the silent, terrifying hours of the Hollywood night. The evening of June 15th, 1959, settled over Los Angeles like a suffocating wool blanket. The heat was stagnant, clinging to the asphalt of Benedict Canyon Drive and trapping the exhaust fumes of passing cars in the heavy air. Inside the house at number 1579, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. George Reeves was pacing the hardwood floors. The physical structure of the mansion bought and paid for by Tony Mannix had completely transformed in his mind. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a holding cell on death row. He was acutely aware of every shadow cast by the California moon, filtering through the windows. He knew that the syndicate did not operate in the bright, revealing light of the California sun. They operated in the margins. They moved in the dark. Reeves had consumed a dangerous amount of alcohol. He was self-medicating, trying to drown the relentless, screaming paranoia that had taken up permanent residence in his skull. But the scotch only amplified his dread. He was exhausted. He had not experienced a full night of uninterrupted sleep in weeks. The muscles in his neck and shoulders were locked in a state of rigid, painful tension. The severe lack of sleep and relentless paranoia pushed Reeves to his breaking point. He spent this final, sweltering California night wide awake, gripping a loaded 9mm Luger, his nerves entirely shredded by the weight. Leonore Lemon sat in the living room, a glass of vodka in her hand, utterly oblivious to the invisible crosshairs painted on her fiancé's back. She was complaining about the heat. She was complaining about the lack of entertainment. She was complaining about Reeves's foul mood. Her voice was a sharp, grating noise that cut through Reeves's frayed nerves. He looked at her and realized the profound, fatal mistake he had made. He had mistaken her arrogance for strength. He had brought a civilian into a war zone, and her ignorance was not a shield. It was a liability. They had gone out earlier that evening for dinner. It was a miserable affair. Reeves had kept his back to the wall. He scrutinized the faces of the waiters, the valet, and the other patrons, looking for the cold, dead eyes of a mob contractor. He ate nothing. He drank his dinner. When they returned to Benedict Canyon, he locked the doors. He checked the windows. He retreated to his bedroom upstairs, seeking the only meager protection he had left. He stripped naked. The physical vulnerability of his nakedness was a stark contrast to the impenetrable bulletproof suit he wore on television. He lay on the sheets, staring at the ceiling. The 9mm German Luger rested on the nightstand a few inches from his right hand. It was cold, heavy, and entirely useless against an enemy that owned the police force. Shortly after midnight, car headlights swept across the front windows. Uninvited guests had arrived for a late-night drink. Leonore Lemon welcomed them inside, pouring vodka, while their loud conversation drifted upstairs. To Reeves, the noise was an infuriating violation of his paranoid protocol. He stormed downstairs, confronted the guests, and yelled at them to leave. But the crushing weight of his reality quickly reasserted itself. He apologized, poured a drink, and retreated to his dark bedroom. Downstairs, fueled by alcohol, Leonore casually delivered a chilling prophecy to her guests. He is going to go upstairs and shoot himself. Minutes later, a heavy noise echoed from the upper floor. "See," she allegedly said, "he's opening the drawer to get the gun." The guests sat frozen, participating in a grotesque waiting game. Then the final sound cut through the heavy California night. A single, sharp, deafening crack. A gunshot. The sound of a 9mm Luger firing inside an enclosed space is violently loud. It is impossible to mistake for anything else. George Reeves was dead. The man who played an invincible hero had been reduced to a chaotic crime scene, and his debts were permanently erased. The 45 minutes. What followed next is the most damning, terrifying piece of evidence in the entire timeline. When a gunshot rings out in a house, human instinct dictates an immediate, frantic response. People scream. They run toward the noise to help. They scramble for the telephone to call the police and summon an ambulance. Panic is the natural biological reaction to sudden violence. The people sitting in the living room of 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive did none of these things. They did not run upstairs. They did not scream. They did not pick up the telephone. They poured more drinks. For 45 agonizing minutes, the guests sat downstairs while the blood of George Reeves soaked into the mattress above their heads. 45 minutes is an astronomical amount of time in the aftermath of a fatal shooting. It is a calculated, deliberate void. It is a black hole designed to swallow evidence and manufacture an alternative reality for investigators exploring the murder theory. This 45-minute gap provided the exact window needed for the true architects of the evening to go to work. If a hit was indeed ordered by the syndicate, the actual shooting was only a fraction of the operation. The rest involved the cleanup, the orchestration of the crime scene, and the management of the official narrative. According to this theory, a professional cleaner would not need to break down doors. They would have keys. Tony Mannix had a key to the Benedict Canyon house. Eddie Mannix had access to everything his wife owned. The entry was silent, efficient, and authorized by the invisible masters of the city. The crime scene in the upstairs bedroom was chaotic. It did not resemble a clean, quiet suicide. A man intending to end his own life sits on the edge of the bed or stands in front of a mirror. He places the muzzle against his temple or in his mouth. He pulls the trigger. The body falls. The gun drops. The scene is static. George Reeves's bedroom was dynamic. It told the story of a frantic, desperate struggle for survival. To those questioning the official report, it looked as though the invincible hero had fought for his life. The physical evidence screamed of a violent physical altercation. A suicidal man does not fire warning shots into the floorboards or engage in target practice with his ceiling before turning the weapon on himself. For those who believe Reeves was murdered, this chaotic room suggests a staged tableau. Crime scene analysts and Hollywood historians point out that a man who shoots himself leaves fingerprints, sweat, and oils on the weapon. Yet the German Luger was found completely wiped clean of any human contact. If a professional cleaner was present, their actions were swift but flawed. After allegedly sanitizing the gun, they made a catastrophic physical error. The spent brass casing was found underneath George Reeves's dead body. A fired casing cannot eject from a weapon, defy the laws of physics, and wedge itself underneath the dead weight of the shooter. To skeptics of the suicide ruling, it was a rushed cover-up, banking on the LAPD's well-documented relationship with studio fixers like Eddie Mannix. Mannix did not need a flawless crime scene. He only needed an excuse for the police to stamp the file suicide without asking questions. Downstairs, 45 minutes had passed. The alcohol in the glasses was gone. The silence in the house had become absolute and terrifying. The script required the final act to commence. The audience had to be notified. William Bliss finally stood up. He walked up the stairs. He pushed open the door to the master bedroom. He saw the naked, bloody body of the man who played Superman. He did not attempt to administer first aid. He did not check for a pulse. He turned around, walked back down the stairs, and looked at Leonore Lemon. The charade was complete. The waiting period was over. The stage was set for the authorities to arrive and play their predetermined roles in the theater of corruption. Someone finally picked up the telephone and dialed the police. The official story. The call echoed through the switchboards of the Los Angeles Police Department. Shortly after, the flashing red lights of patrol cars painted the manicured lawns of Benedict Canyon in harsh, rhythmic strokes of crimson. It was the early hours of June 16, 1959. The officers dispatched to 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive did not arrive with the frantic urgency typically reserved for a reported shooting. They arrived with the slow, deliberate pace of men who already knew their lines. They stepped out of their vehicles. They did not draw their weapons. They did not secure the perimeter. They walked up to the front door of the luxurious home bought and paid for by Tony Mannix. They were not entering a crime scene. They were entering a soundstage. And the script had already been finalized by the studio bosses who supplemented their municipal salaries. The officers walked into the living room. They found Leonore Lemon, William Bliss, Carol Van Ronkel, and Robert Condon. The guests were heavily intoxicated. They were sitting amidst half-empty glasses of vodka and scotch. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the undeniable stench of a coordinated lie. A competent homicide detective would have immediately separated the witnesses. A competent detective would have noted the 45-minute delay between the gunshot and the emergency call. A competent detective would have treated everyone in the room as a prime suspect in a murder investigation. The LAPD officers did none of these things. They asked a few casual questions. They listened to Leonore Lemon slur through a disjointed, contradictory account of the evening. She repeated her bizarre prophecy. She claimed she knew George Reeves was going upstairs to kill himself. She claimed she narrated his suicide from the comfort of the living room sofa. It was a confession of staggering apathy, if not outright complicity. The police nodded. They took rudimentary notes. They did not challenge her timeline. They did not press her on the delay. They accepted her narrative without a single point of friction. They were not there to interrogate. They were there to validate. The officers proceeded up the staircase. They pushed open the door to the master bedroom. They found the naked, lifeless body of George Reeves lying on his back across the mattress. A bullet hole marked his right temple. A 9mm German Luger rested on the hardwood floor beneath his right hand. The scene in the room bore all the hallmarks of a violent, chaotic struggle. The police observed the spent brass shell casing wedged underneath the dead weight of Reeves's torso. They saw the extra bullet hole embedded in the ceiling. They saw the other bullet hole gouged into the floor near the foot of the bed. They looked at the German Luger. They did not dust it for fingerprints at the scene. They did not wrap Reeves's hands in paper bags to preserve gunshot residue for testing. They did not photograph the room from multiple angles to capture the impossible physics of the crime scene. The lead officer looked at the body of the most famous television star in America. He looked at the extra bullet holes. He looked at the wiped gun. He made a decision that defied every standard procedure of forensic science and criminal investigation. He declared the death a suicide. The entire assessment took less than an hour. A murder investigation was aborted before it ever began. The officers called the coroner. They requested the removal of the body. They walked back downstairs. They told Leonore Lemon she was free to go. They did not arrest her. They did not detain the guests for further questioning at the precinct. They let the only people who were inside the house during a fatal shooting simply walk out the front door and disappear into the Hollywood night. This was not incompetence. Incompetence implies a failure of ability. This was a flawless execution of a systemic protocol. The Los Angeles Police Department of the 1950s was deeply, fundamentally compromised by the syndicate and the studio system. Eddie Mannix did not need to make a phone call to the responding officers on the night of the death. The officers already knew who owned the house in Benedict Canyon. They knew Tony Mannix had purchased the property. They knew Eddie Mannix was her husband. They understood the invisible boundaries of their jurisdiction. The LAPD did not cross Eddie Mannix. When a dead body turned up in a property linked to the fixer of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the police understood their role. Their job was municipal sanitation. Their job was to clean up the mess, stamp the paperwork with a legally binding conclusion, and ensure the syndicate faced zero institutional scrutiny. The body is cleaned, the truth is buried. The erasure of evidence accelerated once the body was removed from the house. The corpse of George Reeves was transported to the county morgue. In a standard forensic investigation of a suspected suicide involving a firearm, the body is treated as a pristine evidentiary canvas. The skin is tested for gunpowder stippling. The hands are swabbed for chemical residue. The trajectory of the bullet is meticulously mapped to determine the angle and distance of the weapon. The coroner's office ignored every single protocol. The body of George Reeves was immediately washed. It was a profound violation of forensic procedure. The water washed away the blood, the sweat, and any potential trace evidence left by an attacker. It washed away the lack of gunpowder stippling on his temple, a critical detail that would have proven the gun was not pressed against his skin when it fired, but rather fired from a distance. The hands were scrubbed clean. Any possibility of proving that Reeves had never fired a weapon that night was literally flushed down the drain. The coroner performed a perfunctory autopsy. He noted the fatal wound. He ignored the bruises on Reeves's body that suggested a physical altercation. He signed the death certificate. Cause of death: self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The body was then rapidly handed over to a mortuary. It was embalmed with terrifying speed. The embalming fluid destroyed any remaining chemical evidence in the tissues. To those who refused to accept the official ruling, the studio machine had not only erased the man, they had buried the truth. The morning newspapers delivered the official narrative to the American public. The headlines were brutal and absolute. Superman kills himself. Actor depressed over failed career. George Reeves found dead. The studio executives at the television network acted with ruthless corporate efficiency. They did not issue statements of profound mourning. They did not celebrate his legacy. They recognized that a suicide tainted the brand. They immediately canceled production of the next season of Adventures of Superman. They pulled syndication deals. They erased George Reeves from their ledgers. The asset had depreciated to zero. He was written off as a total loss. Children across the country woke up to the news that their invincible hero had surrendered to despair. The illusion of the Man of Steel was shattered. The public accepted the story because the public wanted to believe the authorities. They believed the LAPD. They believed the coroner. They could not fathom that a beloved television icon could be executed in his own bedroom by the mob. They could not comprehend the sheer, terrifying power of the syndicate that operated beneath the glamorous surface of their favorite entertainment. A mother refuses the lie. But the illusion of a clean suicide failed to convince the one person who truly knew George Reeves. Helen Besselo Reeves, George's mother, lived in Illinois. She received the phone call. She heard the official story. She refused to accept it. She knew her son. She knew he was terrified in the weeks leading up to his death. She knew he was desperately trying to escape the grip of Tony Mannix. She knew he was planning a future, albeit a flawed one, with Leonore Lemon. He had a plane ticket booked for an exhibition tour in Australia. A man planning a lucrative international tour does not put a bullet in his head. Helen Reeves possessed a formidable will. She refused to let the LAPD bury her son under a lie. She traveled to Los Angeles. She demanded answers. She met a wall of official silence. The police refused to reopen the case. The coroner refused to amend the death certificate. The studio executives refused to take her calls. She was an outsider attempting to breach an impenetrable fortress of corruption. Desperate for truth, Reeves's mother hired Jerry Giesler, the most feared defense attorney in Los Angeles. Giesler was a shark who knew where the bodies were buried. He secured access to the bedroom, analyzed the impossible ballistics, and publicly declared the suicide ruling a farce. He demanded a second autopsy and prepared a massive legal assault. The syndicate watched with cold detachment. They did not attack Giesler publicly. They utilized back channels. Giesler began receiving anonymous phone calls mentioning the routes his children took to school. The underworld applied overwhelming pressure to his fundamental sense of security. Suddenly, the most aggressive lawyer in California scheduled a press conference and announced his complete withdrawal from the case, citing vague personal reasons. It was a public demonstration of the mafia's absolute supremacy, and it left Reeves's mother completely isolated and powerless. The Los Angeles authorities permanently closed the file on George Reeves. The official ruling remained suicide. The case was dead. The cover-up was completely successful. The aftermath for the living. The aftermath of the death settled over the lives of the survivors like toxic ash. The syndicate had liquidated the liability, but the psychological collateral damage was immense. Leonore Lemon, the volatile fiancée whose arrogance had catalyzed the tragedy, fled Los Angeles. She returned to New York. She attempted to monetize her proximity to the dead hero. She gave sensationalized interviews. She tried to sell her story to tabloids. She claimed she was a grieving widow. But the underworld had no further use for her, and the mainstream industry considered her toxic. She descended into severe alcoholism. She drifted through the margins of society, living in cheap apartments, pawning the jewelry George Reeves had given her. She died in obscurity, her loud, demanding voice finally silenced by poverty and addiction. She never faced a single legal consequence for her actions on the night of June 16, 1959. Tony Mannix secured her revenge, but the cost was her sanity. She had ordered the destruction of her prized possession. The asset was smashed. The jewelry was crushed. But the victory brought no satisfaction. She remained trapped in the opulent prison of her marriage to Eddie. The house in Benedict Canyon, the property she had purchased to house her pet actor, became a monument to a mob hit. She could not sell it. She could not live in it. It stood empty, a physical reminder of the blood on her hands. Tony descended into a rapid, brutal cognitive decline. She developed early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Her memory fragmented. The glamour of her youth faded into a confused, terrified old age. Her mind constantly circled back to George Reeves. She reportedly built a bizarre shrine to him in her home, surrounded by photographs and memorabilia from his television show. The man she had treated as a disposable object became the obsession of her decaying mind. Years later, according to persistent Hollywood lore, Tony Mannix allegedly confessed her involvement in the death of George Reeves to a Catholic priest. While this claim remains entirely unverified, the rumor insists she admitted he was executed because he tried to leave her. The confession held no legal weight. The statute of limitations on the truth had long expired. It was merely the desperate final utterance of a woman seeking spiritual absolution for a syndicate crime. She spent her final years battling Alzheimer's, her legacy permanently tied to the brutal ecosystem of the studio fixers. If the underworld whispers hold true, Eddie Mannix suffered absolutely zero consequences. In the eyes of those who doubt the official report, the fixer had orchestrated a flawless cover-up. He had utilized his alleged control over the LAPD, his connections to the coroner's office, and his ability to intimidate the highest levels of the legal profession. To them, he had demonstrated that he could order the death of a global icon in a Beverly Hills mansion and walk away without a single detective knocking on his door. Eddie continued his reign at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He continued to clean up the messes of the studio elite. He continued to bridge the gap between the corporate boardrooms and the Chicago outfit. He lived a life of absolute impunity. The law did not apply to him. Morality did not apply to him. He was a force of nature in a city built on artificial light. Eddie Mannix did not face justice in a courtroom. He died peacefully in his bed in 1963, suffering a massive heart attack. His funeral was a massive, prestigious event attended by studio moguls, movie stars, and high-ranking police officials. The men who had aided in the cover-up of George Reeves's death stood by Eddie's casket and mourned the passing of a great Hollywood executive. The syndicate boss won. He lived a life of ultimate power and died with his secrets legally intact. The curse of the hero. The legacy of George Reeves is a tragic paradox. To millions of people who grew up in the 1950s, he remains the definitive image of a superhero. He is the square-jawed savior in the red cape. The man who represented truth, justice, and safety. His image is frozen in time, a symbol of mid-century American innocence. But the reality of his existence is the ultimate indictment of the entertainment industry. To many historians and fans, George Reeves was the first casualty of the superhero curse. A curse that was not supernatural but systemic. His life and death exposed the brutal mechanism of the Faustian bargain that defined the golden age of Hollywood. The studios and the underworld offered fame, wealth, and immortality. In exchange, they demanded total ownership of the human being. George Reeves accepted the bargain. He allowed himself to become a piece of property tied to Tony Mannix and the shadow empire of Eddie Mannix. He believed he could use the syndicate's infrastructure to fund his lifestyle and then simply walk away. He misunderstood the nature of possession. When the underworld acts as your bank, the debt is never forgiven. The interest rate is your autonomy. The collateral is your life. George Reeves thought he was playing a role. He thought his public profile protected him from private violence. If the enduring Hollywood legends are true, he learned in his final moments that the syndicate does not care about television ratings. According to the darkest theories of his death, George Reeves tried to sever the tie, and in response, the men sent by the syndicate did not negotiate. They simply reclaimed what Tony Mannix had bought. In this version of history, hitmen placed a sterilized Luger on the floor, tucked a brass casing under his dead body, and vanished into the night. Whether it was a tragic suicide born of despair or a calculated execution orchestrated by the fixers, the result was the same. The invincible Man of Steel was left powerless on his own bedroom floor. A final settlement paid in full. To those who reject the suicide ruling, the story of George Reeves is not a tale of a depressed actor succumbing to despair. It is a terrifying documentary of organized crime operating with impunity and a brutal reminder of what happens when a studio asset becomes a liability. The cameras stopped rolling. The studio lights went dark. And the hero was allegedly liquidated in the shadows, not by supervillains, but by the executives who owned him. This was the story of George Reeves, a man who played the strongest hero in America while living under the thumb of a machine far more ruthless than anything written into a comic book. A machine built from studio power, underworld leverage, and the kind of money that buys silence, rewrites police work, and buries the truth beneath headlines. In the end, the cape did not protect him. Fame did not protect him. Public love did not protect him. Because in Hollywood, the image was never the man, and when the machine decided the man was no longer useful, the image survived. He didn't. From Pizzaverse Studios and Palermo Productions, this is another look at the real machinery behind the myth, where glamour hides rot, where power hides violence, and where the stories told to the public are often the cleanest part of the crime. Stay with us, because the deeper you go into old Hollywood, the uglier the truth gets. We appreciate you, not just for watching, but for paying attention. Because most people, they take the story at face value. They hear suicide, they close the book, they move on. But you didn't. You stayed. You listened. You looked at the cracks in the story instead of the surface. And that right there, that's the difference. This ain't just about George Reeves. This is about how power works, how stories get shaped, how truth gets buried under money, influence, and silence. The machine only works when nobody questions it. And you're asking questions. That's why we do this. That's why these stories matter. Because once you see how it really works, you don't unsee it. So from all of us, we appreciate you being here, we appreciate you staying sharp, and we'll see you in the next one. Because trust me, this ain't the only story like this. Not even close.
Around and around the rugged rocks, the ragged rascal ran. I look like Superman, why don't I sound like Superman? I look like Superman, why don't I sound like Superman? I look like Superman, why don't I sound like Superman? I look like Superman, why don't I sound like Superman? I look...
How'd that cross necklace get over your horns? You know the saying, I bet you be sweating like a whore in church, spending too much time trying to hide behind the Bible. Get in front of it, find out that Jesus was a foreigner. Virgin Mary, you would've deported her. Not before your husband found out she was a minor, he'd have ordered her. Him and his buddies would've recorded her, transported her, extorted her, and then sent her to the coroner. You don't get to pray for me. You won't bless your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. You don't get to pray for me. You won't bless your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. I'm pretty sure that God's annoyed of racists bringing him up. Sick of you chumps showing up to take a sip of the cup. You called the Aztec savages, but the cup, isn't it blood? Isn't the stuff symbolic? Oh, it's different, huh? Introduction to blood sacrifice. He died so you can't commit your crimes. Here's the hoping he come back to life. I can't wait to see the face on every single preacher's wife. All them secrets you've been keeping, tell me how you sleep at night. All them evil things you feeling, don't leave cause you be polite. Cause this even and the thieving ain't concealed as recondite. Only a few people know. And you know why they keep it tight. You don't get to pray for me. You won't bless your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. You don't get to pray for me. You won't bless your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. Weaponized all of it, don't know what a proverb is. Cherry picking Bible scripts, oh my God. Arrogance, lying in the Lord names ain't honoring. Pride leading the blind again, oh my God. You must be drunk off the blood of Christ. Or maybe you just back hitting the hooch again. Or back to cosplaying a hooligan. The grip, the cross, to get the dollars, like what? Now you forgot where you and your hoochie been? You don't get to pray for me. You won't bless your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. You don't get to pray for me. You won't bless your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians.